Hey guys, in this lesson we're going to learn about causality, which is definitely one of the trickier concepts on the LSAT. But also when you start to understand causality and what it wants you to do, it's actually pretty interesting. It doesn't end up being that bad. So in this lesson, what we're going to be doing is taking a look at what causality is and defining causality. From there, we're going to take a look at the difference between causality and correlation, and then the difference between causality and conditional logic. Okay, and then we're going to wrap up by coming up with a causation strategy and applying it in some practice problems. Let's get into it. So why is causality important? Why am I spending X amount of time in my day studying causality? Because it's hard, guys. A lot of people think that they've got a good grasp of what causality is, but I find that a lot of the time you guys are actually confusing causality with number one, conditional logic, or number two, correlation. Both of those things are actually pretty stupid things to confuse causality with. And what's even stupider, causality most often shows up in strengthen, weaken, and flaw questions, which statistically are going to be your hardest questions on this test. So if you can follow along in this lesson, practice and hone your causality skills, then you're well on your way to acing some of those harder problems and being ahead of that curve. So what is causality? All right, causality is another type of relationship. Okay, so on the LSAT, we have two big categories of relationships, really. We have conditionality and we have causality. Well, causality has a lot of the same elements as conditionality. They're both directional relationships, for example. Causality says that you have one thing that acts to cause another thing, and that's the result. Put in abstract terms, A causes B to occur. Made easier, for example, like you've got smoking causes cancer or salt causes you to be bloated. All we're saying is that our first entity or thing or idea is the root cause, the reason for your second thing to occur. Let me give you a real example, okay? Something the LSAT would say. A store raised their prices 25%. After that, sales dropped. Therefore, the store should lower their prices back down. What I'm establishing there in that example is that the store's price increase is the reason, the root cause for the sales dropping. Now, that's bad. Bad, right? You can't do that. And the reason why it's bad is the focus of this lesson. We're trying to fix up that thinking in your guys' brains, okay? What we had there in that example was an observation, actually two observations. We said that a store raised its prices, and then we said sales dropped. But we have no evidence to show that the price increase caused a decrease in sales. No anecdotal evidence from customers, no study done to see why, and that why is the heart of causation. It's the beating heart of causation. Whenever the LSAT gives you an observation or a set of observations, you should immediately ask yourself, why is this true? Okay, the very next thing our argument did was commit itself to that causation. The author took the observation and decided to commit himself to one single explanation for it out of all the possible explanations. That's no good. You can't do that. The LSAT is a critical reasoning test, right? Critical of the reasoning, which means that when you have a conclusion, you need to have evidence to back it up. Otherwise, your conclusion is flawed. It's crap. Okay, here we have no evidence to show anything other than the price and decrease in sales are maybe related. But we definitely don't have evidence to show that the increase in price definitely caused a decrease in sales. Okay, so now we've seen an example of how causality functions. Let's learn how to recognize it when it does pop up on your test. First, you need to understand the essence of causality, which basically is you have something causing something to happen. Duh, right? That's pretty easy. We have a few words up here on the board that tell you when causation is presented. Screenshot these, memorize them, tattoo them into your brain. They are important. Okay, these words are going to be caused by, because of, reason for, leads to, promoted by, product of, taken effect. When you see those words, okay, what you want to think in your head is they are saying caused by. They are saying this is causation. So take, for example, if your argument says reason for, say caused. Okay, replaced in that word, and that should maybe make things a little bit more intuitive, easier for you to see that causation in the argument setup. Because I think a lot of those kind of keywords that they use maybe are a little bit misleading. Like, for example, promoted by. Kind of sounds like they're saying it helps or it's assisting. No, it means causation. Okay, that's another place where that LSAT vocabulary kind of screws you guys up, where they're using words on this test differently than how we use them in everyday normal life. Okay, these terms are going to allow you to recognize when the author sets up the concept of pretty simple causality, right? In other places, you have harder conditional logic expressed, harder causation expressed, and we're going to cover that a little later in the course, but for now, this should be more than enough to get you started with causality. Let's take a look at an example. A year ago, my buddy Sam weighed 250 pounds. As part of his weight loss regimen, he started reading nutritional labels. He now weighs 200 pounds, so it seems that his weight was promoted by his reading of nutritional labels. So I have my observation here. My buddy, he lost 50 pounds. Good for him, right? We observed that. It's pretty impressive, right? Good for Sam. But then we go on and we say, okay, as part of his losing weight, he started reading nutritional labels. Again, fine, that seems like a pretty smart thing to do. But then we go to my conclusion. All right, we have our causal indicator word here, promoted by. What evidence do we have for that causal indicator, for that causational conclusion? For all we know, Sam could be reading the nutritional label on 10 McDoubles and then just working out for 8 hours a day, right? He'd probably, still lose 50 pounds depending on how he's working out, okay? We need evidence, all right, that he's actually using the nutrition labels. They sneak these observations past you and give you a little subtle causation setup, hoping that you'll miss it. Don't miss it. I've said this probably 1,000 times so far in this course. The LSAT is a critical reasoning test. When you have an argument, ask yourself, would I be convinced of this if someone said this to me on the street? Okay, now let's take a look at a real example from a real LSAT question. Hey guys, in this part of the lesson, I'm working through a real LSAT question for the application, okay? I'm not allowed to show you guys real LSAT questions. If you want to see the application of this, please join my course. The link is down below. So if we're not being skeptical, we get sucked into this idea of causation. All right, I think that stems a lot from people's lack of confidence with this test. You guys view the test writers as the experts, and you're not so likely to have the confidence to go out and call the test writers out on their crap. But let me point out to you, if you got to the point that you're taking the LSAT, it means you're smart enough to be here. You can't get to this point by being an idiot, all right, or faking it, right? The LSAT should have the same threshold of believability as day-to-day life. If someone came into your personal space and told you something stupid, something that just didn't make sense, would you just agree with them and be like, oh yeah, okay? No, you probably wouldn't, right? So then why, when the LSAT presents you with a BS argument, would you just agree with it, right? Or make excuses for it? Ask yourself, am I convinced? That goes a long way into helping you on this test because, again, it's a critical reasoning test. Be critical of your reasoning. All right, so if we're being smart test takers and we read a causal setup such as this one that I just gave you, we should know that we have 3 perfectly good scenarios, okay? And I'm going to give you an example right here, and I'm going to walk you through those scenarios. So, people who drink lots of seltzer water have poor kidney function. Thus, drinking seltzer water must damage their kidneys. Okay, watch out, LaCroix drinkers. All right, so we have our observation here, and then we have the author's explanation for that observation and the conclusion. Logically, for this kind of setup, you have 3 different options. Number 1, the author's correct and it's causal. It's fine, it could be, right? Number 2, the author's an idiot and he's got it reversed. Maybe poor kidney function causes you to crave seltzer water for some reason, right? Number 3, the author's wrong and there's no causal relationship. Maybe there's a third element, something not spoken about, that causes both poor kidney function and craving seltzer water. That would mean that there is no causal relationship between kidney function and seltzer water. They're just related. They're correlated, but it's not causality. When 2 entities or ideas or things are related but not causal, we say they are correlated. More specifically, correlation is when you have a relationship between 2 variables, but it's not explicitly defined. That relationship is not defined as to what it is. A lot of the time on the LSAT, we have correlation in our premises, but then go on to have a causal conclusion. That is 100% not allowed, guys. I need you to be 100% aware of that. You can't have correlation presented to you in your premises and then have a causal conclusion. It's just not allowed. It's wrong. Let me give you another example of that. Premise 1. In Europe, people eat a lot of cheese. Premise 2. In Europe, there is a low incidence of heart disease. Conclusion. Therefore, eating cheese lowers your chances of getting heart disease. In our example here, we have two observations. Number 1, that in Europe, people eat a lot of cheese. And number 2, that there's not a lot of heart disease there. Okay, fine. Then we go on to conclude that one must be causing the other. We can't do that. We don't establish any kind of link between the two except that they both happen in Europe. Tons of things happen in Europe. People drive small cars. Does that lower your risk of heart disease as well? Of course not. So just to recap, here we have a causal conclusion and just correlation in our premises with a very weak link. It's a geographic link, right? But what if we have a causal premises? That definitely changes things up a bit for us, all right? Before we get into our example, I want you to remember that your job on the LSAT is never, ever, ever just refuting your premises. All right, the test writers want you to be focusing on the reasoning that the argument takes to get from the premises to the conclusion. They don't want you judging the truth or, falsity of a premise. So with that in mind, let's take a look at what causal reasoning looks like when we have it in our premises instead of just in our conclusion. Okay? Premise 1, eating cheese lowers your risk of heart disease. Premise 2, people in Europe eat a lot of cheese. Conclusion, people in Europe have a lower chance of heart disease. See, that is okay. That's a logical argument. Why? Because we definitively established a link, a causal link in our premise. When you have something explicitly stated in your premise, you don't have to question it. It's not your job to question it. What you're supposed to question is how do we get from our premises to our conclusion? Okay? The LSAT is a critical reasoning test. Don't forget that. I've said it enough in this lesson for you guys to never forget it. Your job is never to contradict a premise. Your job is to question, do your premises support your conclusion? In this case, they do. Okay, because we have causality in our premise, so we can have a causal conclusion. Causality supporting causality. Two defined relationships backing each other up. So this is something that I addressed in the conditional logic lesson, and I'm going to bring it up again because it's so freaking important. Causality and conditionality are two very, very, very different things. Don't be an idiot and mix these two things up. All right, let's talk again about some differences between the two things. Because if you do that, then you lose points. If you confuse them, you lose points. If you lose points, I'm going to cry, and you don't want to see me cry. I'm an ugly crier. It just ruins everybody's day. Number 1, in conditionality, your two events are not set to a specific timeline. You don't have your sufficient condition causing your necessary condition to happen. Remember in that lesson, I gave you guys the example, right? If you got a 180 on the LSAT, then you studied. In this case, getting a 180 happens after you studied. But in causality, you're locked into a timeline. Your cause has to happen before your effect. Studying 30 hours a day causes you to get a 180 on the LSAT. Right? In that setup, however unrealistic, sorry guys, your studying has to happen before the 180. You have locked in a timeline. Your cause always has to happen before your effect. For number 2, we have different indicator words, right? Thank God, right? There's different indicator words showing conditional logic and causation. If you have your indicator words memorized, then you won't screw this up. It's very simple. Okay, this is one of those places where the test actually can be a little bit formulaic. And even though I hate those formulaic approaches, if you feel yourself getting confused on test day, there's nothing wrong with just using your indicator words to identify which setup you have, falling back on that just to get some footing. Number 3, what's the difference? They're totally different. A sufficient condition does not make your necessary condition occur. Your sufficient condition doesn't have to physically make your necessary condition occur. That's bad logic. Think about it. We're using, again, another old example. If you're in Paris, then you must be in France. Okay? Being in Paris is not physically causing you to be in France. Okay? If we juxtapose that to this, eating McDonald's causes heart disease. Right? In this case, those McDoubles are literally physically putting fat into your arteries. Okay? You guys see, it's a different relationship, totally different setup. Do not fall for that trick of equating the two of them, even though some people diagram them the same with that arrow. Know the difference functionally between the two of them, all right? What is the conceptual difference between conditionality and causality? So now we have to take a look at the broad strategy of causal reasoning. First off, it's not used on the LSAT the same way that causal reasoning is used in day-to-day life, okay? If someone comes up to you on the street and they say, hey, we have a cause for something, we kind of know in the back of our minds that there can be multiple causes all contributing to the same effect, okay? Or, different paths to get to the same effect. Like if I come up to you on the street and I say that eating McDonald's causes you to be fat, you would probably accept that and say, yeah, that's probably true. But you don't in your mind immediately jump to the conclusion that that's the only cause of me getting fat. Okay, we know that in fact, eating McDonald's definitely isn't the only way to get fat, right? I could eat 30 pounds of carrots in a day and just turn into a big tub of carrot lard, right? But the LSAT test writers don't look at causation in that same, kind of colloquial day-to-day way. If you have a stimulus saying that something is the cause of something, then there's this underlying idea that this is the only possible cause, which is, drastically different from how we would see causation in normal day-to-day life. All right, and that is usually kind of the pitfall of people's LR scores when it comes to causal reasoning. So let's take a look at an example. Premise 1, people with Macs tend to be more creative. Premise 2, people who are more creative have longer lifespans. Conclusion, therefore having a Mac causes you to live longer. I wish, right? What we have here as a flaw, our two premises are linked very, very weakly. In this case, what are they linked by? Creativity. And we use this one little link to immediately just glue them together and form a definite absolute conclusion that having a Mac definitely causes you to live longer. Does that make sense to you guys? Probably not, but as that argument is presented, it probably looks fine, right? You've got two correlations set up. It seems like they kind of overlap with that creativity, but they don't have to. Okay, our minds are wired to look at causal reasoning as a possibility. Yeah, sure, based off of that, it's possible that Macs could cause you to live longer, but the LSAT is testing causal reasoning as an absolute, and we should always be wary of absolutes. If they're saying in our conclusion that having a Mac causes you to live longer, then they're saying Macs and only Macs are the only potential cause of living longer in this scenario, which unless we have a direct link in our premises is not something we can say. So what do we do with this? How do we gain points with this knowledge I'm giving you? Well, we have to be able first to identify causal relationships. Earlier in this lesson, I gave you guys the causality indicator words. Have those memorized, okay? But after you recognize causality, we need a plan of attack. First off, causality is primarily tested in the assumption family, mostly in strengthen, weaken, and flaw. So if you see causality in your stimulus, then probably be expecting one of those question types. If it's a flaw question, all you have to do is say the author presumes unjustly that a causal link is defined simply by correlation. That's a real answer choice I pulled out of a test, right? Or they could say some other pretentious way of saying we have correlation in our premises but causation in our conclusion, just with their fancy pants language. If we have a weakened question with causality, then you can do a couple things. Number one, you can just state literally any other cause besides the one presented to you. Number two, you can provide an example of a time when you had the effect but not the cause, which would kind of just be a counterexample, right? If you can have the effect present but not the cause, then how would your cause be causing the effect, right? Number three, provide an example of a time when your cause happened but then you didn't get your effect. Okay, this breaks that kind of absolutism they have around the cause and effect relationship. If sometimes you have a cause but not an effect, then your two observations are just correlated, not causal. Okay? So that's the causation lesson we've got worked up. Now I'm going to have you guys work some practice problems with me and then some problem sets on your own to really master this topic. And definitely causation is one of those topics you really want to hammer out because its effects are kind of widespread in both logical reasoning, RC, and logic games. It's a big point bang for you guys to get. So I'll see you in the problem sets.